Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. I'm Suzanne Sherman. I'll be hosting you here over at the Cerberus Radio Network for the next hour. Here we like to say we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. We had a week off, but fear not, I was busy then. I was doing some radio work. I had an article published. We'll get into a little bit of that later. It's Monday, July 22nd. Jeff Johnson's here with me. Justin Spears is going to be joining us as well momentarily. He has an announcement to make. So just because we're off the air doesn't mean we haven't been busy behind the scenes. I want to give a big shout out and thank you to our friends in Owensville, Missouri. Missouri Liberty Radio has agreed to pick up and run with the Wasatch Report. And we had a nice conversation over the weekend, and it looks like they're going to be maybe running some of our other shows as well. So that's exciting news. I was also approached by the team for Adam Kokesh, who's quite a colorful character running for the Libertarian ticket for the United States president office coming up in 2020. So we're going to be interviewing him. I've got a book of his that I'm reading, and I'll get ready and prepared to have that interview. And we'll probably give him the whole hour. I think it'll be pretty exciting. I have an article from the 10th Amendment Center that came out also, I believe, last Monday. We'll do a show about that later on in the week. I just don't really feel like talking much about the Supreme Court today, but the article is entitled "The Supreme Court Simultaneously Tramples State Sovereignty and the Fourth Amendment." Nice job, boys and girls. This was a case that had to do with drawing blood from a person suspected of driving under the influence of alcohol. They're unconscious and having it done without a warrant. So it's a pretty interesting case, but again, don't feel like doing it today. We've got some really cool stuff to cover. We're going to talk about the heat wave going on. That's a great opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, which would be preparedness. There's an interesting case about schools in Pennsylvania and how they're threatening parents with taking their kids away. Justin can comment on that as well. Tom Massie has a proposal to repeal the Gun-Free Schools Act. And then again, we're going to talk a little bit about normalcy bias as well. You can listen to us live YouTube. If you're in here live, we have a live chat going on. Submit your questions in there. We'll get them on the air. You can also send me a private message in Facebook Messenger. Facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network is the link for the page as well. We have a SoundCloud page. You can download all of that. Free downloads. And then we have a Radio Co link that is pinned, I beg your pardon, to the top of our pages, and you can listen to content 24/7. Jeff Johnson does a tremendous job of keeping the product up there as fresh as possible. Again, we've got an announcement to make in that regard, but even though we were off this week, there was some stuff that you could be listening to that I find is always highly informative. So you can also find my articles, blogs, our social media channels for the network to listen live. Or on SoundCloud at SuzanneCSherman.com, and my article from the 10th Amendment Center will be there as well. So let's see, what else do we have? Well, Justin, let's just bring you on. I opened my email this morning and got a wonderful letter from you, and I thought, why don't we get you on the show and share with our audience what you have in store for us?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be on. I appreciate you letting me join. We've been in some conversations over the last couple of weeks about possibly coming up with a show to do. For those that have been with the network for a while, you may remember that my cohort, Mike Margison, and I had a podcast that we did called The Other Side, and that show ran on the Cerberus Radio Network. We tabled that for a period of time while we were working on our book that I've mentioned a couple of different times, which we are getting increasingly closer to having ready for publication. But Suzanne, you had reached out and said, what about possibly bringing a show back? And I molded over. I was able to get out of some obligations that I had at school through coaching. And I'm excited to announce that I will be launching a new show relatively soon called Fencing with Shadows. And I'll fill the listeners in a little bit more about that as we get closer to time with that. I will also be putting my blog that I have on my website, edfailure.com, all one word, edfailure.com. I have a blog that I put up about once a week. I try to stay on top of it. As a matter of fact, I'm currently working on a new blog entry this morning, and I'll put that into audio form, and we will have those files available for download and listen as well. So all the content that we're working on, we're trying to get made available through Cerberus Radio Network. And as I've said many, many times, I really appreciate the support from both Jeff and Suzanne, and really excited to be moving forward with that.
Well, we're delighted. And you also have had the Foundation for Economic Education publish a couple of your articles. Quick update on that, please. Just remind people.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the work that we were doing with our book, we wanted to kind of get out, and build a brand, build a following, get some readership going. And so we've published a couple of articles that highlight really kind of an overview of the book and the system and the failure of our public education system. So you can read both of those, part 1 and part 2. I published a piece over there on Generation Z and the difference between Generation Z and millennials. You can read some of that over there. I've also had a couple of articles published through the 10th Amendment Center. As you mentioned, Mike Meharry and Michael Bolden, both very great defenders of liberty through the 10th Amendment Center. And I've had a couple pieces published over there on teaching citizenship and government civics and things of that nature, using the principles of what are behind the 10th Amendment, and the people and the states taking back the freedoms and liberties that we should all enjoy and protect. And so, yeah, I've had some stuff published over at both of those outlets as well.
Well, the 10th Amendment is considered the heart and soul of the Constitution, according to Thomas Jefferson. And you guys missed all the fun last week when Jeff was out in Maine. I came across a post on Facebook. We're not going to get into it too much today, but it's a gal out here running for Utah's congressional 2nd district. Her name is Mary Burkett, and something that she had written as a comment on this voice, Keep My Voice Utah, I think it's called, said that she would never vote for anything that did not preserve the prestige of our military. So, my eyebrows kind of raised a little bit. So I went to her website, and there was a paragraph that she has subsequently told me she's going to have altered or removed. And I hope it's because she's had a change of heart, not because of how egregiously unconstitutional this is. But she said, well, I believe in the 10th Amendment. I like when they say, but I think that we all need to work together when it comes to law enforcement. Otherwise, we're going to have anarchy. So be that as it may, I had a big debate on that page with not only her, but her supporters. And then she was generous enough to discuss the principles that she was supporting on a show with Brian Hyde and myself over on Loving Liberty. So we'll get into that and do a show, but we've got a lot to cover on today's show as well. And since you're here, and since Jeff is from Pennsylvania, I want to share, speaking of the failure of the education system, parents in a school district in Pennsylvania received a letter warning that their children could end up in foster care if their parents do not pay the overdue school lunch bills. The letters went out recently to about 1,000 parents in the Wyoming Valley School District, led to complaints from parents and a stern rebuke from the Luzerne County Child Welfare Authorities. So apparently they did this without consulting the authorities in charge in juvenile dependency. The district said that it's trying to collect more than $20,000 and that other methods to get parents to pay have not been successful. 4 parents owe at least $450 apiece. Now let's pick this apart. If you are, first of all, there should be no obligation for the state to even have these school lunch programs at all. I never had my lunches paid for me when I went to school, but I also rode to school in a covered wagon. But be that as it may, if a parent's having a hard time paying $450 for their kids' lunches, I would bet that they're probably struggling. And to have the school come down on them and threaten, on top of everything else that might be going on, that they could lose their children to the juvenile dependency system, to me is egregious overreach. The letter claims here, the article continues, that unpaid bills could lead to dependency hearings and removal of their children for not providing them with food. And this is the thing, they are providing them with food. The school's feeding them. The school just wants their money. And I bet you that the school's making a pretty decent profit on that, but that's just a supposition on my part. You can be sent to dependency court for neglecting your child's right to food. The result may be your child being taken from your home and placed it in foster care. Do you have any thoughts on this, Justin?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that popped out to me as you were going through that, and as I was reading through the article earlier. The first, and you touched on a couple of these. The first is number one, and it's kind of a dirty little secret in school corporations, school districts, at least around the area that I'm in. I don't know how it is national, at least here in Indiana. There are many school districts that have gone to using Aramark food services to provide food to their kids. And this is actually a battle that I have had as a parent. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds here with this, but one of my sons in particular, oftentimes will get extras. He is going to be in fourth grade next year. So second grade, third grade years were really tough with this. And so our account balance kept draining really quickly. And we had many multiple email exchanges with the cafeteria supervisor, the principal. We even brought in the superintendent of the school district at one point to inquire, the policies and procedures. And basically what we were told is, look, we can't manage this to the point where we place a hold on your child's account. And we were just trying to simply figure out and find out what could we do to make sure that he was only getting what it was that, he was allowed to get, which was one tray, and he kept getting charged for a second tray. And ultimately what this all boils down to is they want to make their money, right? And so I think that that's one aspect to this that needs to get looked at is, what is the food services policies and procedures on how these kids are receiving their food. The other thing that you hit on is that quote there, you can be sent to dependency court for neglecting your child's right to food. Well, let's back the card up a little bit and talk about these school lunch programs. Our Belle Michelle Obama, who made it her first lady focal point on healthyplate.gov to go in and basically just ramrod all of this ridiculous stuff through schools about what can and cannot be served. That ought to be looked at as neglecting a child's right to food, because if you look, there are many guidelines about what can and cannot be brought into schools in terms of food choices and options. And there's been all kinds of stories about lunch shaming that was occurring down in preschools and kindergartens, where children were bringing in lunches from home and they were basically being taken away from them, and they were given a school lunch because some bureaucrat had deemed the lunch that was sent in by the parent to be not worthy of the child to eat for nutrition reasons, based again off of the healthyplate.gov guidelines.
I think
so there's a lot going on
they
there.
even said they considered French fries a vegetable.
Right. Yeah. There's one meal in particular that the kids at my school like to really poke at. It's basically like breadsticks. That's the meal. It's breadsticks and salad. And it's just ridiculous, the whole guidelines. And if you're not familiar with what the guidelines are, as I said multiple times, you can go to healthyplate.gov, I believe is the address, and you can look at some of the different guidelines that were instituted again under Michelle Obama's regime as first lady. And again, so there's a lot going on there. You've got the profit motive of the school, and a lot of them are outsourcing their food services to third-party vendors, which I think raises a lot of ethical dilemmas and questions that aren't even being addressed. I'm sure the schools are getting a cut in on that as well. So they're going to do everything they can to promote that. And then ultimately, what authority does the school have to serve as the arbiter of what you can or cannot provide to your child as far as what you think is healthy and nutritious? There's just no reason for that to be occurring. And this letter it does overstep boundaries. There's no doubt about that.
Well, even the lawyer that drafted it, his name is Charles Coslet, said he doesn't consider the letter to be threatening, but then you can hear him just smirking. Listen to this sentence. Hopefully that gets their attention. And it certainly did, didn't it? I mean, if you think about it, you're here this morning because some parents cried foul because he or she doesn't want to pay a bill attributed feeding their kids. How shameful. He's the one that's behaving shamefully. This is funny as well. Now we know that in every school, we're going to have kids with peanut allergies, right? So now we're going to add another layer of stupid on this because they have a federal programs director, Joseph Muth, said that the district had considered serving peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to students with delinquent accounts, but received legal advice warning against it. Let me share something here. We have considered all things government to be the bird feeder of society. I have a friend who's been a special ed teacher her entire professional career. She retired a couple years ago in South Carolina, and she told me that they would not only feed the kids while they were at school, but they would send them home over the weekend with something called a buddy bag because these kids weren't getting enough food. And one kid, I don't remember what exactly the story was, but he was either eating the food before he got it home or whatever reason, the buddy bag wasn't making it home. And the grandparent of this child called my friend and said, could you please make sure that that buddy bag makes it home? Because without that buddy bag, we don't have enough food for the entire family over the weekend. So not only are we feeding these kids at school, but we're actually supplementing the families over the weekends. So a lot of people that are saying, America's never going to be a socialist country. Well, if you've got your kids in the public school system, guess what? We're socialist and you're contributing to it. This goes into the normalcy bias that we're going to get into a little bit later. We really don't see what's going on around us here. We've got a dog in the background. My phone rang. I'll tell you what, when my phone rang at 7:00 this morning, I think the reason it rang again, we're going to shift gears here too. Jeff, while you were away, I kind of became reacquainted with the fine art of sleeping in. So my phone rang at 7 and I was worried that it was you calling me, that I was supposed to be on the air. But it was actually an alert from Summit County saying that there was a hazmat spill on Interstate 84. And I was traveling that stretch of highway Saturday, and it was completely blocked. And with this extreme heat that we're having in the remote location, it reminded me that I want to talk a little bit about preparedness. But before we do so,
I want to comment on
Yeah.
this last story here first.
yeah.
It is interesting that Wyoming County contains the home of one Joe Biden. That's his home turf. So, and it is a highly Democrat area. They want to rule everyone's lives. It's not very surprising. And, it is interesting here in PA. A number of years ago, there was going to be a strike in Bradford County. That's where I live. And the teachers were threatening a strike. So some ingenious person FOIA'd everyone's salaries from the school district, and they posted them in a newspaper, and it shamed these teachers into not going on strike. I'm not going to get into it. I mean, it started in the in the mid, like 150,000 a year, down to in the 60s. And it was really funny because they were going to go strike because they weren't making enough in a county where the average income, because it's a very poor county, was about $16,000 a year. So most of the people that they were serving, their children, were making substantially less. And once it was out there that what the average salary was and what they were making, the strike went away, and they continued on with the school year. But it is interesting that we have this whole idea where you have all these elites telling you that you must pay and you must do what they tell you to feed your children, obey, or we'll take them from you. It's more of this big brother, this 1984 Orwellian world that we're moving into.
And this also, again, it embraces the normalcy bias. What is really draconian is, which by that I mean making it compulsory to put children in government schools for 12 years minimum. Now they're talking about expanding that into the preschool years. What did Hillary Clinton say? We've got to get to these kids early, not to take care of them, but to indoctrinate them. We've talked about that. And this is why I'm so excited. Well, I've always been a big fan of Justin, but why I'm so excited that he's going to be doing a show focusing on this. But you also mentioned Joe Biden, and his nasty little mitts are involved in the story that I want to bring up next, and that is Representative Thomas Massie is introducing legislation to repeal gun-free zones. And this is by Jose Nino, who's written frequently for the Mises .org website. And he writes a lot about firearms. But this piqued my attention, and I'll tell you why. But on June 12th, he went on a station to discuss, meaning Massie, introduction of the Safe Students Act. I love how they always have safe as something, even if it's something we like or don't like, they always have to put a layer of safe, the label of safe on there. Under the legislation, the one size fits all federal ban on guns in school zones would be eliminated. Now, this is interesting to me because I thought the case of Lopez versus the United States, I'm sorry, US versus Lopez took care of that. It was a Commerce Clause case, but I'll get into that momentarily. Since the Virginia Beach shooting, the issue of gun control, going back to the article, quickly came back into national discussion, pardon my French. As expected, renewed cries for gun control instantly came into the picture. Emotions run high during these events and after, as we all know, when they preach more gun control. They often cloud people's judgments. That's what happens. Don't think clearly. Interestingly, the perpetrator of the shooting had acquired his gun legally by going through the standard background check that every American citizen must go through to acquire a gun. So any more gun control is security theater at best and would have been futile in stopping him. I agree completely. Instead of offering some milquetoast half measure or even capitulating to the anti-gun pressure, Massie presented a pro-liberty alternative to the dilemma, getting rid of the gun-free zones at school by introducing the Safe Students Act. The Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 would be repealed in order to allow teachers to carry firearms in self-defense. He introduced similar legislation in 2017 and 18 in hopes of repealing the law. In 2017, he defended his legislation, stating that gun-free school zones are ineffective. They make people less safe by inviting criminals into target-rich, no-risk environments. They prevent law-abiding citizens from protecting themselves and create vulnerable populations that are targeted by criminals. Curiously, the gun-free, they call it here the GFSZA, the original Gun-Free School Zones Act, had bipartisan support. Every time they say bipartisan, you know that the rest of us are going to get hard in the Liberty Department. And that was 2020 Democratic Party presidential frontrunner Joe Biden introduced this legislation, and Republican President George H.W. Bush signed it into law. Folks, do you really think it's worth our time to fight this whole Democrat-Republican paradigm and have that be the extent of our, what is it Tom Woods calls the index card of allowable opinion? We've got to start thinking of other solutions here. That's a topic for another show, but it's stuff that we've talked about before. So anyway, since 1950, 98% of the mass shootings have taken place in gun-free school zones, schools being one of the primary locations as because again, it's a target-rich environment with zero protection. 30 years in existence, it's become abundantly clear that this law is a failure. So Massie has acknowledged this obvious trend and has the courage to do what's right. It might not be the most popular idea, but someone has to start the conversation about repealing gun-free zones. Such a measure would save countless lives and bring back more autonomy to local school districts when it comes to providing security services. Here's the thing. The Black Robe Messiahs have decreed that the law enforcement officials that we trust to protect our children, since the schools are gun-free zones, have no obligation to protect them. This came to a head in Broward County. So what they're saying here is we have a federal law saying you can't carry a gun on school. And by the way, don't expect the police to protect you. But by golly, you better get your kids there on time and you better pay for their lunches, or we're going to take your kids and we're going to put you in jail. Interestingly enough, there was a case called United States versus Lopez, where the Gun-Free School Zones Act came before the Supreme Court. And it was justified, and this is how ridiculous the argument was, under the Commerce Clause. Attorneys for the Fed said, well, if the kids can't feel safe in a school environment, they can't get a decent education. If they can't get a decent education, that's going to affect interstate commerce. That even makes Wickard v. Filburn sound reasonable. The Supreme Court gave that one the thumbs down. So my question is, if this was struck down on that basis, why is this still even an act that's in force right now? So I have to do a little bit more research on that one. But I'll tell you what, the answer doesn't depend on Congress repealing this law because they had no authority to enact it in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, what can be done? Jeff, I'm going to give you this one. What is the legal status of a federal law that goes beyond its constitutional authority?
It's null and void. It is not a law, according to Jefferson and Madison.
The states can ignore this. Oh, no, they can't, says Mary Burkett, congressional hopeful from the state of Utah, 2nd District, because according to her, well, I would never coerce a state. I asked her on the air, what do you consider coercion? Bribery. But she continued, I would certainly withhold federal funds. Justin, can you please tell me what the hell the difference is?
Well, I would say next to nothing, really. And the thing too about going back to the school zone issue as well here, and you hit on such a great point there with the Broward County and the decision to that law enforcement has no legal authority to have to offer protection. This essentially just makes these places sitting ducks. And so one of the things that I always think is important, and I don't want to get too far off on this, but when people are kind of pondering these things and hopefully asking questions of themselves as they're hearing what we're saying, the logical progression that you need to go back to is, right, well, what would cause a school shooting in the first place, right? I mean, clearly the person or perpetrator, whether it's a student or a citizen in the community that has a vendetta, whatever it is, that gun-free schools sticker that's so nicely squared up on the glass of the front door, the person's not walking up and, oh man, I picked the wrong place. This is a gun-free zone. I can't do this here. That's never going to fly. Clearly, its intended purpose, it's not even accomplishing what it's intended to do. So you need to go back and think about that as well when you're looking at this. Is the intent of this gun-free school zone thing and the whole notion of what was argued about kids feeling safe in school. Slapping a sticker that says you're not allowed to bring weapons into this building isn't accomplishing or even coming close to accomplishing its intended purpose.
Which just shows that they're absolutely disingenuous in saying we want to keep the children safe. What I say is gun control is the holy grail of the Marxist platform, because while we are still armed, they cannot fully implement to their ultimate desire to control us as much as they would like. So again, no matter what, it is up to the states to ignore these laws. We are seeing the states capitulating to the feds time and time again. Ultimately, you're going to have to ask yourself, is this solution even workable? It's kind of a seed I'm trying to plant in people's heads. One of the reasons I write all these articles, I'm trying to point out how our system of federalism is failing time and time again. Ultimately, what are we going to do? I'll tell you one thing. The answer isn't in voting harder. I joke about it all the time. By golly, I'm going to use my Sharpie this time. And you know what? Stomp your foot when you draw that line and fill in those circles too, by the way. That'll really help. So I want to cover, did you have anything you want to say, Jeff? Because I want to get into a little bit of Ted Cruz here before we move on to some preparedness.
No, move on to Cruz.
Wrap it up. Ted Cruz, the constitutional conservative, doesn't seem to understand what the Constitution set up, and that is a federal system of government or certain issues, namely the one that we're going to talk about today, is none of his darn business. Ted Cruz accuses Portland mayor of Antifa support, calls for investigation into the violent protests. This is actually from Newsweek. Ted Cruz accused Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler of ordering police to stand down and allowing Antifa protesters to physically engage conservative activists over the weekend. Wheeler is also commissioner of the Portland Police Bureau, and he's been targeted by an onslaught of criticism over the most recent clash between far-right and anti-fascist groups in the city on Sunday. I would submit to you it's not far-right, it's Antifa and anybody else who doesn't march to the beat of their drum. Conservative journalist was assaulted. We were talking about this last week, Jeff. They're actually putting Quikrete in milkshake cups. That could be a lethal weapon. Federal law enforcement, investigate and bring, he's addressing federal law enforcement, investigate and bring legal action against a mayor who has, for political reasons, ordered his police officers to let citizens be attacked by domestic terrorists. Okay. This is absolutely none of the business of the federal government, whom the state's delegated to punish, regulate 3 crimes: piracy on the high seas, counterfeiting, and treason. This is a local criminal matter. You can say, well, their civil rights have been violated. I've had this discussion before. When you raise a constitutional question outside the purview of the Constitution as ratified, you are violating the Constitution. I had an expert tell me, I'm not going to bring up his name right now on the air, but if somebody punches a guy in the face and that person said his civil rights are violated, that boots it into federal court. Well, why bother having state courts? This is the problem when we nationalize every single question. There is absolutely zero authority for the general government to investigate local lawlessness. This was my point of contention with Mary Burkett. I said, give me an example of the anarchy that's going to ensue if the federal government is not involved in law enforcement. And the example given, and that's why I'm bringing this up right now, because this is what we're talking about in Oregon. Well, look at Chicago. It's in chaos. Okay, how is that any of your business? How are you going to tell the people of Chicago what to do? Well, we're not going to, but we're going to facilitate getting things better. We're going to bring them to the table. I said, do you really think that the elected representatives of a major metropolitan area like Chicago aren't capable of bringing themselves to a table to talk? What else are you going to do? And that's where we got into the withholding federal funds and, again, getting the feds. Now, when we talk about the absence of the federal government participating in law enforcement resulting in anarchy, well, let's look what we have here. We have in Oregon, as in Chicago, the municipal law enforcement. Then you have county law enforcement. You have Illinois state law enforcement. Anarchy is described as a system without law or government. And I submit to you, people come up with their own laws for peacefully dealing with one another. We don't need government to do it. 3 layers of government interaction. Somehow we're going to have anarchy if the feds don't stir the pot as well. This is absolutely nonsensical, and it is just a reminder that the feds think that somehow they have come from a separate colony, or maybe they're fed some separate royal jelly that makes them more capable of handling local affairs than those of us in the unwashed masses in the metropolitan areas. How does that make sense? What makes these people more qualified to manage our lives? A war was fought over this. Consent of the governed, representation. Going back to Ted Cruz, to all law enforcement, find and prosecute these violent felons, Cruz said via Twitter. Talk about doing this for political gain. I think he's grandstanding and he's just trying to get some attention here. Police have received information that some of the milkshakes thrown today during the demonstration contained quick-drying cement. We are encouraging anyone hit with the substance today to report it to the police, and that's according to the official Portland Police Twitter account. Again, Portland Police look like they're trying to handle it, but again, this is also not a matter for the federal government. Questions, comments, gentlemen?
Yeah, Suzanne, I would chime in with something. I'm actually writing my blog today on something fairly similar to this. You brought up a great point, and that is, especially people in Congress, represent a district within a state. And that's done for many reasons. Number one, for representation matters. It's, virtually, even when you look at the numbers of how many people they represent today, it's almost virtually impossible for them to be able to live up to the standard of how many people they represent. But what I think is most important to kind of flesh out from this as well is, these people that represent congressional districts or senators that represent a state, that state or that district has its own individual culture and society, the rules that kind of govern that. When I traveled over this summer, I went down to Atlanta, and I just recently returned from the Carolinas. There's a different culture down there, the way that life is, conducted on a daily basis. Some of it is, what you might call just like little details or, minutia or whatever, but some of it's radically different. The way in which, traffic, for example, as one thing, traffic signals and roads and things of that nature, the way that people interact with one another. What I'm getting at is, what does Ted Cruz know about the culture of the Pacific Northwest? What does he know about the culture of Portland, Oregon, that would qualify him to even make these statements? That's something that is, like you said, should be left to the people of that area to handle. And I think the design of government that way was done on, intentionally for that reason, because the people, going back to the foundation of the country during the Constitution debates, was these states were seen as individual countries. And what would a farmer from the Carolinas know about a merchant from, Vermont? It doesn't compute when you start getting that, like you said, the nationalization of everything in our government. It's going to create issues where you have people unqualified to be making choices beyond what you were saying too, is the different layers and levels of local government to handle these things.
Well, exactly. And it's like saying, what would King George or Parliament know about the goings on and the needs in Tidewater, Virginia at the time? And then again, when 13 sovereign and independent states ratified a new form of government under this United States Constitution, it was premised on exactly what you just said. What do people now in New York have any business telling individuals in Indiana, rural Indiana, what to do in your area? And this is the problem. This is why we have a federalist system where certain areas are off limits to the general government. And our constitutional conservative, Ted Cruz here, absolutely ignores that. And I remember first questioning him when I was paying attention, and he was chiding the Obama administration for failing to prosecute and enforce federal marijuana laws, which were, by the way, unconstitutional. And this just goes to show that being a conservative doesn't necessarily mean that you believe in limited government. And that was my point with my debate with the congressional hopeful out here as well. I want to turn to some preparedness, but before I do, I want to address an article that came out recently, and this was from Off Grid Survival, about normalcy bias. This is something that we've talked about before. And normalcy bias here, they describe it as the biggest threat to your survival during disasters. We have this tendency to think everything's going to be okay, or something's not going to happen here, even though that we know that it has. Whenever a natural disaster hits, the article starts out, survivors can usually be divided into two groups: those who are prepared ahead of time. That's kind of why I'm here, to get you to be in that first group. And those that don't. The people who don't prepare usually operate under the mindset that everything is going to be fine, nothing bad is going to happen. They underestimate the effect of natural disasters, no matter how many warnings have flashed before their eyes. So when they ask about what normalcy bias is, they define it here as a psychological state of denial people enter in the event of a disaster, as a result of which they underestimate the possibility of the disaster actually happening and its effects on their life and property. Their denial is based on the assumption that if the disaster has not occurred until now, it will never occur. And now I've got a couple ideas or events that popped into my mind. They're not all natural disasters. The two that were not natural disasters were the shooting in Las Vegas at the music festival. A lot of people considered that thought they were maybe just fireworks. Nobody really knew. And in fact, the event organizers turned on all the spotlights illuminating the crowd so the gunmen could actually see where these people were. There wasn't a plan in place, and people again didn't see cover because they weren't sure what was happening. Another one, I don't know if you guys remember this, but the band Great White was playing. I forgot where. It was back east somewhere, and over 100 people lost their lives when the pyrotechnics got made contact with the soundproofing material. And as people are watching this conflagration start backstage, they thought it was actually part of the show. What is the number one rule of survival? We talk about, especially Arthur T. Bradley in his book, The Handbook to Practical Disaster Preparedness for the Family. You can get that on my Amazon affiliate link, SuzanneCSherman.com. By the way, this is the Cerberus Radio Network. And these people stayed in there. The number one rule of survival is to get out of the way. But when you really don't perceive these events in the proper context, that something really bad is happening, you're going to make possibly a deadly mistake. We know there's Tornado Alley. We know we have flooding in the Midwest. We had major heat storms this year. West Coast, earthquakes are not predictable, but we know they're going to be there with regularity. And that's really what got me started on preparedness as well. Once I became a mom, I had always felt guilty beforehand, or probably more irresponsible than guilty, that I hadn't really thought about earthquake preparedness. But being a mom really changed that. So I started having bags ready, like little go bags, shoes by the beds, and food and water stored up. And then it grew from there, where I started growing my own foods and preserving them, and ultimately left California to live in a place where I could live a more prepared lifestyle too. So I decided to be prepared. I also have on my website, again, SuzanneCSherman.com. If you go into my blogs, there's an article called The Recalcitrant Prepper. So what if you're somebody that wants to be prepared and have that prepared mindset, and you have a family member that really isn't quite on board? I have a great discussion on there, and I think this would really happen. But again, going back to the normalcy bias, people will say that 41% of the people here admit, and this was in a poll, not being ready for a disaster. And that is the first red flag of the dangers of normalcy bias. You can go into all the details of this article. I'm going to post it on our page as well. But we recently had, with the heat that we have in summer, a lot of people are traveling. I was in the Ogden area on Saturday this weekend, and on the way back I had missed the traffic being blocked both ways, but on Interstate 84, before it gets into Interstate 80, in the Morgan area going westbound, was completely blocked. Now this area is a narrow, steep canyon, and there's a lot of heat radiating off the rocks there, walls on each side, concrete dividers, and it was stopped. And it got me thinking again, time and time again, I come up with reasons to talk about preparedness on my show. What if you're one of those folks driving down the road, you're on fumes, you're going to get gas at the next exit. Kid in the back, I have to go to the bathroom. Next exit, honey. Now you're stuck here for 3 hours. Hot sun. What do? Do you have a plan to be in your car in a hot area, remote area, for hours at a time? Some of the things you can do if you get into trouble: make sure your tank is filled up. Have plenty of water in your vehicle, a means to get yourself some shelter if you have to make another form of shelter. But these are things you have to think about and plan. So it just made me realize people really aren't thinking about this stuff. There have been a lot of accidents out here. People are driving vehicles that they're not used to driving all the time. So they've got fifth wheelers or towing a camper. Maybe they don't drive the RV all the time. Just try to be prepared, and also think of this normalcy bias and tie in with our government here. We were talking about how accustomed we are to having our children being deemed truant, and we're going to end up in criminal or juvenile dependency court if we don't put our kids in compulsory education systems. We have this bias where we don't really realize that we're not as free as we think we are. Any comments, gentlemen, before we get on to maybe some prepping for heat?
Yeah, I would just, I was thinking one thing here too with that, Suzanne. I'm not overly versed in prepping, but I would say one thing too that I've really come as an individual to understanding is my limitations. I just hit 40 last year, and I've had a lot of medical issues. I have both my knees replaced. I've got fusion on my spine and my lower back, and it's really kind of made me think about understanding what my limitations are, especially with two young boys. There were two stories that kind of hit me this week. There was a 32-year-old retired NFL player. I don't know if you saw this story or not, that died of heat stroke in Arkansas after he had been working out in the yard all day. Here's a guy who's, probably in the peak physical condition of his life, if not close to it. But it just shows, that you can't fight certain forces. There was also a story I mentioned that I just returned from the Carolinas. Just north of where we were. We were in Sunset Beach, which is essentially right on the border of North and South Carolina. And just about probably 10 miles north of us, there was a father of 6 who was killed when a wave slammed him into the ocean floor. He hit his head on the sand. It broke his neck, and ultimately was not able to be revived and passed away. And again, I'm not, saying that he was being reckless or anything like that, but I constantly told my boys while we were out, look at those waves. I don't want you out past a certain part of the ocean, just because there were riptide currents and things of that nature as well. So just knowing limitations, I think, is really important, as well as a part of having the preparedness mindset.
We also get into this vacation mindset where we do let our awareness, we kind of just relax a little bit. And you mentioned the ocean. I was just looking on the news this morning. 6 people were struck by lightning in Florida beaches just today. And when you see these clouds turning, you've got to seek some shelter. In fact, I was in Ouray, Colorado last year, and we were at a big geothermal pool area, and the clouds were covering. They were getting nasty. And I told my boys, let's get out of the water and get some shelter. The people that were managing the facility, they didn't call people out of the water until the first lightning struck directly overhead. If that had gone in the pool, countless people would have been injured. So don't rely on other people also to make that judgment call for you. Ultimately, it's up to you. Also, you mentioned somebody that was taken out by a wave. That unfortunately happened to a personal friend of my son, somebody in the racing community here a couple years ago. They took the family and the grandkids to Hawaii. Soon as he got in the water, his first jump into the wave, slammed in, broke his neck, paralyzed from the neck down, had to be they had to raise money to get him flown home. Sadly, he just passed away about a month or 2 ago. So yeah, you got to think about these things. Nobody's trying to ruin your fun here, but if you're not aware, you can't just let your situational awareness slip. Let's turn now. We've got these heat waves. We've got a combination of heat waves and power outages. I tell people, don't rely on the electrical grid. I learned that in California because the grid could not supply the power to the people that are actually power to the people, to the communities that were trying to stay cool. We would have heat storms and then rolling blackouts. So where I lived, it wasn't too horrible. I had a decent sized house, but what about the people that are in the cities that don't have big windows, and they can't get any kind of relief from this heat? How are you prepared? You can't have a generator in a house like that. If you have a family that's in a situation like this, these are things you need to think about. And again, in the book, Disaster Preparedness for the Family, you can get that on my website, SuzanneCSherman.com. There's some really good advice on how to do this. But I was on a trip also a couple years ago. We were on the Colorado River. We were going from Glens Canyon to Lee's Ferry, and it was very hot. And there was a family from Europe, and they had a little child who, within an hour or two, was stretched out on the bench and becoming unresponsive. And the mom wasn't doing anything or asking for any help. And I said, there's something wrong with your child. And we had these things called frog togs. They're these leather or suede type cloths, and we had them to keep ourselves cool. When I went hiking yesterday, I had a bandana, dipped it in a stream, wrapped it right around my neck. The boys and I were just circulating these frog togs and brought this kid back. And I'm thinking that he was in the first stages of heat exhaustion. Now, Jeff, you were an EMT. Can you give us a little bit of background. What is heat exhaustion? What causes it? What are the signs? And if we see that in a family member when we're out in the wilderness, wherever we are, enjoying our vacation or on the beach, what can you do to treat it?
Actually, I want to tell you, right, this person you're talking about was probably past heat exhaustion and was at heat stroke. So here we go. We'll discuss this real quick because a lot of people out there, it's kind of a confusing thing. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke. What's which? What is it? Okay, well, heat exhaustion is, here's the warning signs of it: nausea, lightheadedness, fatigue, muscle cramping, and dizziness. So you're out walking, Suzanne, which you were yesterday. You're up in the mountains and you're starting to feel a little nauseous. You're starting to get cramped up. You are now in the early stages of heat exhaustion. So what can you do? Especially because outside, if you were at home, you'd move into air conditioning, you drink lots of fluids, and you remove the excess layers of clothing. And you can use a cold shower, cold compresses, such things like that. But out there, move to shade, can, get some water, put those wet, cold compresses on, drink lots of fluid. And if it progresses from there, you're not making improvement, you might need to get someone to get on a phone or a radio and radio for medical help to come and get you. Now, heat stroke is moving on from there. Heat stroke will also have headaches, but it'll have confusion and no sweating. If you have somebody that's in a situation where they're no longer sweating, they're in serious danger. They'll also have rapid heart rates and possibly vomiting, and they may lose consciousness. That's why when you said that this person was not responding, that's why I believe that person was probably in heat stroke. What do you do for heat stroke? Call 911. Get this person to a hospital because you are not going to get enough fluids in them. They need to be in a place where they're going to get IV fluids, get central core cooling, and that's what they'll do for them at a hospital. So there's the difference. If you're just not feeling well, you're starting to cramp up, you're getting heat exhaustion. You need to take steps immediately so you don't end up in the heat stroke where you need to be in an ER being treated for that to save your life.
And Justin, you raised a point earlier about knowing your limitations when we're out there hiking, for instance. Jeff, we did a show about this. There was a teenage boy on a Boy Scouts outing who perished in I think it was the Superstition Mountains in Mesa area in Arizona. He didn't have enough water with him and they were hiking. We had our friend Eric Betcher, the survival expert, join us and talk about preparedness. You have to know your limitations. If you're going to go out there hiking, you better bring enough water with you. And water is not light. I mean, I think I had 1.5 quarts with me yesterday, and it's heavy. You got to trek that stuff around. So if you maybe have a bad knee and you know that you're going to be going up and down hills and you need to bring enough water, that might throw you off balance. You break a knee out there or you twist an ankle, roll an ankle out there, you're going to be in trouble. Again, the wilderness is a fantastic place to be, but unless you're prepared, it can be a very dangerous place. So make it both, make it fun and make it safe. Make sure you have the water. And again, know your capabilities. Jeff, you were with me when we were at PrepperCon the last year they had it. And I presented a question to Dave Holliday and Cache Valley Prepper Michael Hawk and Matt Graham. I said, what do you think is the number one mistake people make when they go out in the wilderness? And I believe Mike had said was underestimating nature. And I also said, I think also overestimating their abilities. The combination of both is oftentimes deadly. Very easy to get lost going off trail. I was talking to Dave Holliday at a primitive survivalist gathering. He is, if you're not familiar with him, an absolute guru. He's a legend in primitive survival. He was actually a consultant to the movie Castaway and taught Tom Hanks how to perform some of the survival skills on there. And just listening to him talk about how one time he even got lost. And he's telling me this story. He's out there in the mountains of Flagstaff and he sees some footprints and he recognizes that those were his. Well, he couldn't use the sky to navigate because it was just one constant shade of gray from overcast. But what he did do, and I probably shared this story before, but I really love it, so I'm going to do it again. He sat there on his back. He didn't panic. He didn't cover any more ground. He stopped. That's the number one rule I think you teach people as an EMT. You were teaching also as a paramedic, Jeff. If people are lost and you have to rescue them, just stop moving. And he observed. He knew the general weather patterns in the area, and he noticed a general pattern now, which directions the wind was going. And from that, he was able to ascertain a direction and walk his way out of there. So again, I wanted to bring in some summer survival for everybody. And that being said, Jeff, let's hear a little bit about what you were up to this past week as we wrap up the show.
Oh yeah. Well, we were up in Maine, and we visited some friends there, and we took the four-wheelers in the hauler, and we rode some of the trails up there, which is really interesting because Maine has I'm gonna say it's thousands of miles of trails, and it's part of the international trail system. And there's one trail that you can get on, and you can end up in Canada if you continue to the end of the trail. Now, it's very remote up there. If you're not prepared for these trails, you will get out into the middle of nowhere, and there is no cell service. I mean, unless you have some sort of satellite telephone, you have no way to get help, and you will probably end up being found when they find your rusting hulk of your four-wheeler or whatever you're driving. But it's a great place. I enjoy being up there. It's a lot of fun, and I always look forward to getting up there.
Justin, do you have any vacation plans?
Yeah, so like I said, we just got back from the Carolinas. We did our summer family trip for a week. We went, as I said, down to the border of North Carolina, South Carolina. Got a little bit of history in. Went to Fort Fisher in Wilmington, which, if you are a fan of the Civil War, you will know was one of the last big assaults by the North on the South. Was able to go to the museum there and found out that only about 10% of Fort Fisher remains standing today due to weathering. Almost 90% of that area is underwater. It's in the ocean now, which I did not know going in to see that. So I thought that was fairly interesting. I got some really good pictures of that. Went aboard the USS North Carolina and got some history there as well. So yeah, that was a really interesting trip. And like I said, I'm writing a blog post this morning based off of some thoughts that I had in traveling. I went down to Atlanta, Georgia earlier this year as well. So I've had two trips where I've gone into quote unquote the South. And it just kind of got me thinking a little bit about cultural differences and things of that nature. So I'm kind of reflecting on some things related to that. And that's what I'm writing on for my blog, which I'll try to have up a little bit later on today. But I'm really excited to get the ball rolling with the new show, and a lot of great content writing wise, and hopefully be able to get this book published in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I look forward to all of that. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just going to say the North Carolina is a huge ship. I've been on it. It's a really cool piece of history. I mean, those battleships were just enormous.
Yeah, we did Pearl Harbor at the end of 2018 and went aboard the Missouri and got to see that. And it was really neat to do kind of a compare and contrast to see the two ships and look at some of the pictures that we had taken. They're basically cities out on the ocean. The amount of, just offerings, the full medical, obviously full food, entertainment. It was just, things that you don't normally think about when you're thinking about ships in war. But definitely not a place I don't think I'd want to be.
I've been to a few of those. I've been to the Midway, the Hornet, the Wisconsin over in Norfolk, Virginia. Fascinating to see. And it was really great when my boys were young, and I really enjoyed taking them. As people are traveling this summer, I want to refer you to an article I wrote, Lies My National Park Told Me. You can actually find it in the blog section of my website, again, SuzanneCSherman.com. And it's a longer version of the American Conservatives article that they published, which focused on the Revolutionary Era, called Will the Founders Be Remembered as Slaveholders? But as you go to some of these areas, places of historic significance, keep an eye for the bias and the propaganda that is in contravention to our founding principles and emphasis on distractions that are not that they're unimportant, but they're obfuscating what our real founding intentions were. And that just ties everything in that what we've been talking about today. But we're going to wrap up the show. Justin, I want to thank you for joining us. I look very much forward to your new show. Jeff, thank you. It's great to have you back. I'm Suzanne Sherman. This is the Cerberus Radio Network. Thank you for listening.